In this video I'd like to talk about music hardware and look at equipment which is essential and look at all the additional equipment that perhaps we don't really need. Perhaps look at the question of why we end up collecting so much stuff and whether we could just make do with a computer instead. So before I get into that, I've got a new album which will be coming out relatively soon, so if you'd like to be informed of that, then just follow me on Bandcamp or on social media and that should keep you up to date. Right, let's get on with the video. So a few months back somebody left a comment on one of the D10 videos. Unfortunately I can't find the comment now, and it's quite possible they deleted it. It was a little on the snarky side, which I tend to find kind of amusing really. Anyway, the gist of it was there's no earthly reason to use a D10 these days. It can't offer you anything that can't be done by something else. Yeah, sure, that's true, you don't need to use a D10. But then I thought of the comment in perhaps a broader context, and that would be that, well, you can probably say that about any synth that you don't like, whether it's a DX7 or if you didn't like a Prophet 5 even, but whatever it was, there could well be a synth that you think that there is no point in having. And extrapolating further than that, then is there really a need to have any hardware at all? Why don't we just use all of the millions of plugins that we all seem to accumulate on our laptops? Of course, many electronic musicians and producers don't use anything except software because they don't have any particular connection with hardware from the 90s or 80s or any other period of time, and there are so many emulations of those things anyway that they really don't need it. So think of it from the point of view of those that do like the hardware, which I suspect generally are Gen X and older. Why do we still hang on to this stuff when, to be absolutely brutally honest, we don't really need it? So I'm going to run through a few areas which I think are key to anyone that is collecting and using music hardware, and the reasons they do it. But if there's anything I've missed, then please feel free to stick it in the comments. So if you're producing electronic music these days, you're going to, at the very least, need some form of computer, whether it's Apple or PC or Linux or whatever. I use a basic gaming laptop which has a Ryzen 7 with 8 cores and 16 threads. It's got a fairly generous amount of memory. I think it's 32 gig, possibly. I can't really remember. And it's fast enough for me. I can do whatever I want on that. Although if I do keep adding tracks with lots of very complex effects and the latency starts to build up, but that's something I'll get back to in a minute. I have lost count of the number of plugins I've got in there. I'm currently using Cakewalk, which is incredibly unpopular, but it's taken me such a long time to get to know it and to be able to use it that the idea of switching to another DAW now is like, I just don't want to do it. I think you have to have some form of computer. Beyond that, I think most people would want some kind of controller. So that could be keyboard or something else. And the other thing that starts to become important are things like having a decent quality sound card, and then you can get into the realm of monitor speakers, decent headphones, all of that. In a way you could say that's a must, but if you really are on a tight budget, you can just use an old PC which you can pick up for 50 quid, just plug a pair of headphones directly into the headphone output, and there you go. You'll be able to do some form of music, and you can probably do some very good music with that as well, particularly if you manage your resources carefully. Those areas are the basics. You've got to have that. If you don't have that, you can't really do anything. The sort of hardware that is probably redundant and you don't really need is going to be all these keyboards and sound modules that I seem to be endlessly fascinated with, which are so well out of date that it does make very little sense to use them. but I have some good reasons to use them, some of which will be listed. Part of the reason I started to use hardware after ditching it for a reasonable amount of time was that some of the synths that I'd always wanted back in the 80s and early 90s, I just couldn't believe how cheap they were. And I thought, well, I can afford to buy those now, so why don't I just get them? And then I can enjoy that experience of owning that thing and playing that thing, whatever it happens to be. Initially, I was interested in just rebuilding my old 90s studio, and then it kind of got out of hand, and I thought, well, actually, I've always wondered what that sounded like, and I always want. And this is really, it's partly curiosity, and for me, it was partly nostalgia. I wanted to get back to the instruments that I had originally, and I wanted to try some new things, even though they're well out of date and are quite possibly irrelevant for music making now. So the next thing was to actually be able to get hold of some genuinely analog synthesizers, particularly polyphonic ones. In the early 80s there was quite a diversity of different types of synthesis on keyboards, and analog was coming to an end, and very often you would have synthesizers with digital oscillators, which personally I don't have an issue with because they stay in tune better, and then you would have analog filters. So I'd had an ESQ1, I wanted to get that back, and then there were quite a lot of analog reissues by Behringer. Certainly if it was something that I'd originally had, I was quite happy to rebuy at cheap price. And it was quite nice to become reacquainted with a Wasp synthesizer, and more recently a Pro One. And I think those instruments in particular are a really good argument for having hardware. Although they don't have any memory, so it's very difficult to reproduce the same sounds. What they do have is controls which you can very finely adjust to get the sort of sound you're looking for. I would say that overall I find it a lot easier to program sounds on synthesizers which have got a range of knobs which can all be adjusted very, very finely to get exactly what you want. So that's another argument, the granularity of control. Another reason is going back to sort of the curiosity idea. There are some synths which have not been emulated yet. In fact, there's really quite a few of them. I wouldn't be surprised if over time we end up at the point where we have a software version of practically every synth that's ever existed. Arturia, Cherry, G-Force, they're all getting pretty close. Sometimes they end up bringing out the same synth, which feels like a bit of wasted effort, but then on the other hand, at least you've got two cracks at the same thing. Maybe one version will be slightly better than the other, or they have different strengths and weaknesses. I digress. So going back to the actual hardware, there are certain synths which, for better or worse, have not been emulated, and in fact D10 is one of them. I don't believe there's a clone of that, and maybe there never will be, and I'm sure a lot of people will be happy with that. Another one which I'm been looking at is the VZ1, which I think is probably wandering into kind of DX7 type territory, but it's got an interesting type of synthesis that I want to examine, and I can't do that in software at the moment. Maybe later on someone will take that technology and do something with it. But that's a good reason to get some old hardware. There are going to be certain things out there that just have not been revisited. So this next one is something that is not going to apply to a lot of people, but it's actually great fun getting an old piece of equipment, whether it's good or not, and fixing it and restoring it back to its original working condition. There's something very satisfying about doing that, and it's a kind of side hobby to making music. Doing electronics and doing a sort of engineering based approach to the equipment is a lot of fun. So it's definitely worth looking at as a sort of side hobby. Sometimes it's just fun to be able to turn on a keyboard, plug in a pair of headphones or attach it to some speakers and just play the thing. Now for me that's a fairly limited option, just bashing away a few chords and stuff like that, maybe just scrolling through some presets. But the enjoyment of doing that without having all the fuss of turning on the laptop and making sure the sound card is working correctly and opening a new track because there's too much latency on the last track that I'm working on, and all the myriad things that can stop working for no particular reason just when you quickly want to play a keyboard. It's just great not having to bother with any of that and just turn a keyboard on and play something. So that's a good reason to have something available. And as I've already touched on, latency is an issue that I think bugs a lot of us. I find that if I'm working on a project, as I develop more and more tracks, I get more and more latency between the input and the rest of it. I can't play along anymore. That can be a pain. Back in the 90s, one of the things that would always drive me absolutely insane was that I'd turn on the studio and there'd be some sort of hum somewhere that wasn't there the day before, and I wouldn't know where it came from. And I thought, well, once I get everything into a computer, then I don't have to worry about that. And that was true to a certain extent, although there were other noises that can be a problem. But I soon found that latency was a big problem. So yeah, I don't have to worry about that if I'm just using hardware. I can just go back to worrying about the hum. So a very long time ago I bought an Atari ST and it failed within a couple of weeks because it was second hand. I couldn't really take it back, it just stopped working, and in the end I just had to give it away and hope that someone else could fix it. Now it's always intrigued me. I would actually kind of like to have a studio which was based on an ST and just see where that took me. The limitations of that and a few sound boxes could be kind of fun. Now, all right, it can do all that with the DAW I've already got, but I can see the appeal that people might have towards doing things the old way, having a retro studio, an old computer, old equipment. That could be kind of enjoyable as a sort of side project. I doubt I'll ever get around to doing that simply because I just don't have the space, and I'm really more interested in exploring synthesizers than older forms of recording and effects. I'm not particularly interested in getting a massive collection of effects, but I'm sure many people are. So for a retro studio you need the hardware, and that's pretty much the end of it. Okay, so one last one. Now it seems likely that most people are going to have some kind of keyboard. Now I know controller keyboards can be very useful in certain circumstances, but I personally would prefer to have something that actually makes a noise. So if you're going to have a keyboard, you may as well have one that works fully independently of your setup, but has all the connectivity you need, whether it's MIDI or USB, so that it integrates nicely with your DAW. I suppose in those circumstances then it would make sense for perhaps going for one of the more expensive modern keyboards. I quite like the look of the Arturia Polybrute 12, which certainly looks pretty tasty, and I would have thought you'd be able to create some excellent sounds on that. Plus it has some additional controller options that a lot of keyboards, certainly older ones, don't have. So that would be the way I go. But at the moment I'm kind of happy exploring the various keyboards and modules that I get my hands on. Always looking for a bargain in that regard. Never pay full price. Who wants to do that? So I think that pretty much covers the main reasons that I could think of. Maybe there's a few others and you can put those in the comments if you would like to. At the end of the day, it's a personal decision. It's not necessarily about what's practical, because I think the practical solution for making electronic music is a very, very limited setup. I can't remember which musician it was, but they posted this picture of a laptop on a desk and they said they'd done their whole album just using this. I don't think anyone was surprised. You know, I think they maybe had surprised themselves that all they'd needed was a laptop, but the rest of us were thinking, and yeah, It is the 21st century. You don't need a whole studio to make massive music. You can do it all on a laptop. The bottom line is, no, you probably don't need the hardware. But where's the fun in that? There's so much of this stuff knocking about. It's worth at least trying a few items out just to see if it's of any interest. For me, that quite often means looking at really crap old sound boxes like one of the videos that I did recently. And I fully intend to continue doing that because it actually forces you to work within the limitations that are available to you. And I think that's worth trying every now and then. So, all of that waffle over. Hopefully that's of interest. And thanks very much for watching this. Let me know your thoughts on the subject and hopefully catch you on the next video. Thanks. Bye.